You're listening to the Unstoppable Teen Podcast, episode number 32. Welcome to Unstoppable Teen, the podcast for teenagers, parents and teachers. My name is Kevin Mincher. Every week we will bring you an inspirational person or message to help you experience more success and happiness. Thanks for hanging out with us. Let's get this party started. Hello, Unstoppable Nation. It's Kevin here. Welcome to the show. This episode is all about what we can do to help young people go from teenage trauma to a brighter future. I had the privilege of recently interviewing Lisa Cherry. Now, you may have never heard, maybe have heard of Lisa Cherry. She is a speaker, a trainer and an author that specialises in helping young people, parents and teachers deal with trauma. That's problematic situations that may manifest themselves in many different ways, whether it's eating disorders, whether it's neglect at home, whether it's drug and alcohol misuse. There are all kinds of awful things that can happen during the teenage years. And thankfully, there are some solutions to those problems. And Lisa is an expert in this particular subject. You might be surprised as we get into this interview about some of the things that Lisa has to say, not just about the neuroscience, about what's happening inside a young person when bad things are happening, but the solutions that she offers might be easier to implement than you perhaps would have thought. I'm pretty much sure that you would never have guessed what happened to Lisa in her own teenage years that led her to be so passionate about this subject and to have dedicated her career to helping young people, parents and teachers. I, as you will hear, almost filled up with tears as Lisa shared her own personal story and some of the things that she did to turn it around. I was really touched by the solutions that she offered, having had such personal experiences with bad situations in the past. Rather than me rambling on here, I want to step back and hand over with an introduction right now to Lisa Cherry. I'm delighted to have with us today Lisa Cherry. So hello, Lisa.
Hi, Kevin.
Thank you for joining us and thanks for being generous with your time. We've had some fantastic conversations over recent months. I know about the great things you do to help young people, their parents and indeed their teachers in school. But for those that aren't aware of your work, what is your area of expertise?
Right. Well, I deliver training and conference keynotes and I write books all on the areas around attachment, trauma, resilience and recovery. Now that sounds a little bit like, wow, that sounds really heavy.
Yeah.
But actually, if we break it down, we all have an attachment story. Trauma is something that happens each year to about 20% of people.
Oh, really?
And resilience is something that we all are continuously building on all the time because we are all resilient and we are all vulnerable.
Yes.
And recovery is something that people who've had particularly adverse experiences will have. They'll have a recovery from those experiences. So it's actually very human work, even though it sounds like it's something quite out there. It's actually very much about what makes us very human.
Yeah, we have that tendency, particularly here in Britain, to have the proverbial stiff upper lip and pretend like bad things aren't happening, try and brush it under the carpet and hope that it goes away. I suspect that you're going to provide us with some insights that might be a little bit different to those out-of-date approaches.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's really interesting. I was just thinking then when you were talking about our human physiology, the thing that actually is what has enabled the human species to survive, which is our physiology, our alarm system, our fight, flight or freeze mechanism,
yes,
is the one thing that if that is overloaded through experiencing adversity or trauma, that's the one thing that actually is going to be problematic for us, that we need other relationships around us to heal from.
I think this is a really important topic, and it was why I wanted so badly to get you on the show, that we so often overlook just how many young people are experiencing some really bad things in their lives. And those things could be resolved if they got some really good, proven professional help, which is really what you do. You said 20% of people experience these kinds of bad traumatic experiences. Could you give us some examples of what might be a traumatic experience?
Okay, so the word trauma is something now that we use to describe an emotional injury on the brain.
Okay.
Because we now have, through neuroscience, the ability to actually see the kind of injuries that happens to the brain when there has been neglect or abuse or traumatic experiences. So we use the word trauma in that way, which I think is very helpful. So traumatic experiences can be prolonged experiences. So children, for example, living in poverty, I think, where they have that unavailable parents around them, I think is something that continuous fear and anxiety about where food is coming from, where heating is coming from, children living around domestic violence, children at fear of physical, sexual abuse, children who've been neglected, children living around the kind of experiences that mean that their alarm system is being triggered all the time and is getting completely overloaded. A traumatic experience can happen to somebody where there's been a death, for example, or certainly if we come out of our culture at the moment, we've got lots of children, for example, who are living in continuously traumatic times. I'm thinking particularly of Syrian refugees at the moment.
Yes.
But in many, many countries, we see that. So trauma is something that is a sense of overwhelm for a person who needs to have a therapeutic intervention in order to heal. And may I just add that the most powerful therapeutic intervention that we have available to us are relationships.
So when we've got somebody that's supportive and helpful, they can guide us through a process that might otherwise seem impossible. Because I've had this really bad trauma. You mentioned the children that are coming from Syria and the refugees, and even, domestic children that are born and raised, whether it's here in Britain, America, Australia, or wherever people are listening right now. Through no fault of their own, many young people experience bad things. And what I'd like to ask you is, if those young people don't speak out, maybe they go to school and they're embarrassed and they don't want to admit what their family life is like, what are some of the telltale signs that either their friends could look out for, or that teachers in schools or other parents might be able to look out for to know whether a child is suffering some form of trauma?
I think the easiest answer to that is behaviour.
Okay.
So if we think about, I always say to people when I go and do training in schools, there is no naughty. There's no naughty. There is behaviour that is trying to communicate something to us. And sometimes that behaviour can be incredibly challenging to be around.
Yeah.
And it can also be behaviour that triggers our own systems. So the one thing we want to do is get away from it and get it away from us. Does that make sense?
It does. I think that some of us look through the world through some rose-tinted glasses, and we make judgments of the young people that come across our path, that they're being, as you said, naughty, that they're being rebellious, that they're not being thoughtful or kind or considerate. But we don't often take the time to attempt to look at the world through their eyes and consider what their home life might be like and the reasons why that young person is behaving in the way that they are.
Yeah, and actually, there's no kind of blame game in all of this, because lots of young people are really struggling right now who don't have lots of childhood adversity situations going on. Young people are really struggling right now, I think. There are specific things in this generation that are incredibly challenging and quite difficult for the people professionally to make any kind of active decisions about. So, for example, we do know that self-harm and mental health issues, difficulties have doubled for children and young people. We also know that it can take 10 years between someone experiencing the symptoms of mental health difficulties and receiving help. Now, I think there's a couple of reasons why it's particularly profound right now for children and young people. So I think one of them is an overuse of devices, which I think is affecting the way that people connect. Now, we understand from interpersonal neurobiology that people need people in order to grow and develop and to have optimal brain function, which is what a school wants out of a child and a young person, requires that serve and return between two people in that relationship that's working. So the more we have device use and the more I see this in families, I think that's problematic. The second thing that I think is particularly challenging for our children and young people today is around the continuous stream of global disaster. When I was growing up, we couldn't see this stuff. Okay, there were two things going on in the 80s that we had exposure to. One of them was AIDS, and the other one was around nuclear war. So we were all forced to watch the most desperate film about what would happen should there be a nuclear bomb that basically involved us all going home crying, thinking we'd be eating baked beans in a cupboard. Okay, it was very, very memorable. And you ask anyone who went to school in the 80s and they remember it. And I think it was called Threads or something. It was quite horrid. Now, children and young people through social media and all the adults, all of us actually, but we're, for children and young people who are still growing and developing, the brain hasn't finished growing and developing until you're 25, remember?
Yes.
Are watching continuously overwhelming visions of the world, of what is happening, that they have no control over, can't do anything about, and actually are harrowing. Watching Syria and what's been happening over there, which has been all over our news channels, is harrowing. And I don't think children and young people who are using social media sites actually control what they watch in the way that adults might do.
And the downside of that then over time is that it can normalise things that frankly are quite horrific.
This has an impact upon how we develop empathy. And if we have difficulties developing empathy, then we have difficulties having relationships.
Now, what I'd like to do is I'd like to get to a point where you can provide us some practical things that teenagers can do to help themselves if they're experiencing trauma, or maybe you do to help their friends if their friends are experiencing some form of trauma, but also some practical things for parents and teachers too. Now, before we get to those practical advice, I'm curious about how and why you got into this area of work in the first place.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's a really good question, because it's important, I think, for all of us to acknowledge that, our personal lives and experiences tend to be what motivate us into the work that we do. And this has been my life's passion. And it's no accident that it's been my life's passion, because my own teenage years were so difficult and challenging and required me to get well and to recover from what had happened to me. So my own teenage years were spent in local authority care, which then resulted in me being homeless for a couple of years and finally landing at the age of 20 in an AA meeting where I had my last drink, which is some years ago, I have to tell you. And really, what happened to me at 20, so all about the same time I got housed, a charity supported me to go to college and university, I got sober and clean. All of that happened around the ages sort of between 19 and 21, and that completely altered the trajectory of my adulthood. And I think that people say to me, well, what happened? Did you have some sort of epiphany? And I think it's not that the simplest way of describing it is that you have to have the desire to want to change. And I knew that the way my life was going was not what I wanted. But that desire to change has to intersect with a pathway that enables you to do so.
So let me ask you, Lisa, you experienced some really tough times in your own childhood. You were in the care of the state, essentially, and things went from bad to worse. Reading between the lines, at some point in time, you got involved in drink and drugs. How old were you around that time when things started to go from dark to even darker?
Well, I suppose really the age of 13.
Wow.
And I do believe that whatever hasn't been dealt with in birth will come up. Whatever's not been dealt with from the beginning will come up in adolescence, which is why adolescence can be such a challenging time, because the brain is rewiring. It's actually starting to move everything around. And it can be a challenging time for everybody. But I had a birth separation. And I believe that impacted on me hugely and upon my attachments, relationships. So at 13, things really started to come to the fore, and that's when I went into care. By 16, I was homeless until I was 18. And really, homelessness was about as awful as it kind of got. I mean, I was watching a program last night about women who are homeless, and adults who are homeless have huge complexities and complex needs. And I still was watching it and felt incredibly emotionally triggered watching it. It's such an appalling experience to be so excluded from society. Yeah. But I have to say, in terms of thinking about exclusion, I'd already been excluded out of a family environment. I was excluded from the 2 schools that I went to. So exclusion was something that started to perpetuate. And that sense of not belonging to anything took a very long time to recover from. And I think that's why it really worked for me when I entered into a 12-step program, because all of a sudden I belonged somewhere. And it wasn't just somewhere, it was somewhere that was positive and that was actually going to teach me how on earth I was supposed to live life.
Thank you so much for being open and frank with us. I'm imagining that there are people listening all over the world right now, particularly young people that are listening, that when you first started talking in the first 5 or 10 minutes could have made some judgments about you. We all do that. We hear the tone of somebody's voice and the language that they use, and we start making assumptions about their life and who they are. And I don't imagine that many people listening would have thought that you went through those kinds of experiences in your teenage years. It saddens me that there are many young people going through that right now. And to have had those experiences yourself and now dedicate your life, your career, to helping others that are going through that, to help them have positive outcomes, I have the utmost of respect for. So thank you. What I'd like to ask is, you talked about the desire to change as being a critical ingredient. How did you get there? I'm trying to imagine what it would have been like, and I know I'm not going to get anywhere close to it, but you were homeless, you were drug and alcohol addicted at the time, you were separated from society and didn't feel like you had a sense of belonging. How did you get to that point of, first of all, wanting to change, and then secondly, believing it was possible, that you could turn it all around and have a fantastic future?
Well, I don't think that I believed I could turn it all around and have a fantastic future at that time. But what I do think I thought was that I was not prepared to have my life defined by those experiences. And I also kind of joke when I speak to people about it that I probably had quite a low pain threshold. And I just couldn't take any more, and I couldn't envisage a life of living like that. I just could not see how I was going to stay alive and live like that.
And so you went and found yourself a 12-step program. And which one was it?
Alcoholics Anonymous.
Okay, for people who don't know that, what is that and how does that work?
Well, it's an organisation that's completely and entirely run by people who've had difficulties with drink. Word alcoholic obviously has a huge stigma to it, but at the end of the day, if you're using alcohol and you don't know what's happening and you're having blackout drinking and you're not functioning in life, then chances are that it's a bit of a problem for you.
Yeah.
And, I don't know whether I'd have grown out of that or not. I had such a lot of complex needs at the time. And actually, it was irrelevant to me, and it's irrelevant to me now if I think about, would I have grown out of it or wouldn't I? What was really powerful was actually being in a space with other people who'd also had very challenging and difficult experiences, living a life that looked like something that I might want to have.
So what I'd love to do now, both based on your personal experiences back then and the expertise that you've since gained of working with hundreds, thousands of families and people to overcome trauma, I'd like to get practical. And first of all, I'd like to think about the teenagers that may be listening right now. If they feel that they are experiencing some problem, whether it's drug and alcohol related, whether it's, you mentioned earlier on, self-harm and other mental health disorders, what can they do to help themselves get on the journey to recovery?
I think it's quite age related, because actually we need each other. So if there are not resilient adults around children and young people who need resilient adults around them, that's very challenging.
Yes.
So I would say that the work has to be with the adults. The work has to be with the adults around the children. Adults have a duty to help children and young people alter the narrative about how they feel about themselves. They have a duty to provide environments where it is safe for children and young people to express that something has happened to them. So that's why I talk a lot about attachment and trauma-aware environments, where we do not ridicule people for being essentially human beings and having very normal human reactions to very difficult and challenging things. Adults also have a responsibility to help children and young people learn how to self-regulate, because it's through being able to self-regulate that we can learn how to access the help that we need. So while I'm not saying that there's no responsibility in some way for children and young people to be able to find somebody to talk to and to express that to, those skills and tools come out of relationships with emotionally available adults.
So what are some of the common mistakes that adults make when they're around young people? There's some things that we should be avoiding that might make the situation worse.
Again, that's a really challenging question, because I think a lot of the education system compounds difficulties and adds to difficulties rather than takes away from them. For example, for a child who's experiencing and has experienced trauma, bells ringing every 50 minutes is quite triggering. The sheer challenge of being around up to 1,500 people and navigating and negotiating your way around one room to another can be very challenging. Transitions that are not managed properly are going to compound issues. So where you have also changes in schedule that have not been discussed properly or talked through properly can be very triggering times, because you're about to change everything and nobody told me. Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So there's all sorts of ways that an attachment and trauma-aware environment can be created. And I've got a few bits and pieces and articles on my website that people can tap into to have a look at a more extensive list about how to do that.
Good. Now, if people are listening right now and they'd like to get that extra bit of insight, where is your website? Where could they find those articles?
Okay, so my website is lisacherry.co.uk, but I'm a pretty prolific Twitterer. Or twit, maybe, I don't know. So you can follow me on Twitter on @_LisaCherry. I'm on lots of other channels, but to be honest, I like to hang out on Twitter. I think it's a really good space. I have a Facebook page too, but those are the two places. If you want to go and find out more and connect with me in other areas, then lisacherry.co.uk would be the best place.
Now, I'm going to make sure that we provide some links in the show notes to today's episode so that people can find you super easy and make sure they're at the correct Lisa Cherry website and following the correct Lisa Cherry on Twitter and other forms of social. You've written books as well, haven't you? Yeah. Could you share a little bit of detail about your first one and the ones that followed thereafter?
Yes, well, the first book was not really the book that I wanted to write. And I think I've heard a few writers say that. So my first book was called Soul Journey
Yes.
and was very much about recovery and very much about what are the things that show up time and time again for people who have created a life for them where they've been able to, really be the best that they can be and really live out their potential. What are the themes? So Soul Journey was very much about that. The book that I really wanted to write, The Brightness of Stars, is a very autobiographical book in terms of adults looking back on their experiences of having been looked after. That book is a very, very popular book on early years courses, childhood and youth studies for foster carers. Some local authorities hand that book out to foster carers. It's a very well-read book. And then my third book was very much looking at those complexities in the mother and child relationship, called Steering the Mothership. I've been trying to get my head around writing another book, and I'm just so busy that I just haven't got round to it.
Well, I'm going to make sure we provide links in the show notes again to your book so that people want to do more learning about trauma, attachment recovery and those sorts of things, that they can access those resources really easily. You mentioned earlier that it's a really important skill for young people to learn how to self-regulate.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that? And what would an example of self-regulating be?
Well, one would be understanding your physiology. So understanding what's happening to you when you're starting to be feeling, so that you can start to get to a place where you can say, do you know what? I'm not functioning in this environment. This environment is not working for me. I need to get out. So we often hear teachers talking about timeout cards as a thing, especially with teenagers. What's really helpful is for children and young people to be able to understand when those things are happening in their body. And there are different ways of having those kind of conversations, because we all feel feelings in our body in different places. If I asked everybody, where do you feel fear, for example, people would give different answers. So it's important to help young people understand their own physiology and the way they experience those feelings, so they've got opportunities to not let things escalate, because by letting things escalate, we are adding to the problem. When somebody is in that place, they are surviving, they're not thriving. And if you're surviving, then that is depleting your system. It doesn't give you anything, it takes away. And we know from all the studies that we have seen from America, and now also from Wales, and in this country with Hertfordshire, Luton and Northamptonshire, that adverse childhood experiences create all sorts of difficulties for adults. Other things that are very good around self-regulation are, lots of schools do this, and it's wonderful. Things like yoga, mindfulness, learning techniques about how to create a calm environment, how to create an environment that allows children to understand the sensation of feeling calm and understand what it feels like to be regulated. And the thing about regulation is we have to self-regulate. Babies can't do it at all. Children are learning to do it. Teenagers are also sometimes struggling to learn how to do that. And they need adults around them to help them.
So what role does being more resilient have to play in all of this?
Well, all of those things help us become more resilient. And resilience is about being able to cope and manage with the difficulties that life throws at us. And the thing is, as adults, we have experience to tell us that we can deal with things. Something can happen and we can think, well, do you know what? This has happened before and I was okay. Children and young people don't have that, but we can build that into their narrative. We can start to build that into their narrative by saying, do you remember when such and such happened? And you were okay. And you were able to cope with that.
It's such an important skill. I sometimes think that young people make that judgment about themselves that I'm not very resilient, when in actual fact it's just a muscle that they haven't exercised very much up until now. And the only way they'll become more resilient is not whether they were given it at birth through their DNA, but actually whether they put themselves in situations that require them to become more resilient, to find solutions and push themselves through. Now, I'm not saying there that you should choose to put yourself in vulnerable and neglectful situations so you can build resilience. That's absurd. Of course, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is for young people to volunteer to get involved in some extracurricular activities, in sports, some of the things that you mentioned, helps them develop the resilience muscle so that if and when, and hopefully it never does happen, but should a bad experience occur that might create some trauma, they've got that resilience muscle built up that could help them deal with the situation.
Absolutely. And the thing is as human beings, we are all resilient and we are all vulnerable. And the resilience for children and young people often depends on the resilience of the adults around them.
And the challenge is if you're around parents, or for that matter, teachers that aren't as resilient as perhaps they need to be, and young people don't have a role model for it, then it's going to be challenging for them to learn this stuff, isn't it? Because it's not part of the national curriculum either. It's not something that you're going to get tested on or examined on or even have lessons in. So this is one of the reasons why I want to encourage people that are listening right now to find ways to invest in your own self-development. And whether that's proactive self-development, where you are building up personal competences and skills that can help you prevent traumatic things from happening. And so whether that's using your evenings, your weekends to buy a book from the self-help section of a bookshop, to subscribe to somebody's podcast or YouTube channel that will teach you things that are going to help you strengthen your character and your resolve, whether that's volunteering to go on courses at weekends, or even get involved in you've got an online video series now, don't you? You have a program that's available for teachers, I understand.
I do. I mean, I quickly recognise that having me live, has a cost implication and a time implication, and that's a time implication is hugely challenging for teachers.
Yes.
So I created a course that meant that teachers would be able to go online in a time that suited them. It wasn't about always having to get teachers into the room on inset day or after school for an hour or whatever it was, that they would be able to access the course whenever they wanted to.
Yes. Great. So where could teachers, if they were interested in developing some skills that would be useful for dealing with trauma in the classroom, where could they go to find that stuff from you?
But if they go on to lisacherry.co.uk, there is a drop down on the menu that is about the online video training. Great. Or where you can find my books or anything really to do with purchasing any information or having a scout around the blogs. Fantastic. Or whatever it is that somebody wants to do. That's all on the website.
And I hope you don't mind me saying, Lisa, whether people get engaged in that program or another one, for me, is somewhat irrelevant. What's important is that people invest in their own development. Whether you're a teenager that's listening, you cannot rely on your school to give you everything you're going to need to know to have a happy and successful life. And indeed, if you're a teacher or a parent, you can't rely on the government alone to provide all of the answers and all of the learning situations. We have to develop a culture of investing in our own self-development. And I know that one of my mentors in the past, Lisa, used to say to me, Kev, you can skip a meal, but never skip reading, never skip learning. Now, I know he didn't mean that literally, but for him, that was the importance, the value of continuing your personal development and investing in yourself. I personally won't skip the meal, but a day doesn't feel complete if I haven't done some learning and personal growth that day.
I absolutely agree. And I think I was so lucky, really, because that was never told to me. It was never taught to me, and it's unlikely to be told or taught to anybody else unless you're lucky enough to have a really good mentor. But because I, at the age of 20, went to AA, and at the age of 20 started upon my education that I'd lost, I was in this amazing space of learning. Yes. Personal growth was profound. And my educational growth was profound all at the same time. And it was the most fabulous start to my early 20s, and I will be eternally grateful for having had that kind of foundation, even though it was born out of such really horrible experiences.
Well, absolutely. I think you made the point there that a lot of people have bad experiences in school where for them learning wasn't particularly engaging or entertaining or enthralling or fun. And they think that all learning is like that experience in the classroom when they were younger. When in actual fact, in the digital age that we are now, learning can take place in so many different ways. To wrap things up here, I wanted to ask you one final question, Lisa. You've personally overcome great challenges and built a wonderful life for yourself, and now you go into schools and you spread the word, you deliver your training and your speaking, you write the books, you've got the online resources. For all the experiences that you've had, I'm curious, what do you believe it takes to be unstoppable?
Feel the fire in your belly.
What do you mean by that?
Have as many experiences as you can get your mitts on until you feel some fire in your belly. When you feel that fire, find a way to make money from doing that every day.
I like it. I like it. Great piece of guidance. And that is as true for the more experienced people that are listening, as well as the younger ones as well. Find that fire inside, the fire in the belly. And clearly you've done that, Lisa. I want to, on behalf of all of our listeners, express our appreciation and our gratitude for you taking your time and for sharing your personal experiences and the distinctions that you've made. And can we wish you all the very best for the future?
Thank you so much for asking me, Kevin. I really appreciate it.
So there you go, folks. That was the brilliant Lisa Cherry. I don't know about you, but I got all kinds of insights there. I was shocked that 20% of young people experience some form of trauma. And sadly, all too often, it takes a ridiculous amount of time, up to 10 years, for people to get the help that they need to deal with that trauma. For me, there were some important lessons in there about what Lisa had to say about relationships, that we need each other, so long as those relationships are quality relationships based on trust, support, and integrity. Whatever you got out of this session, I want to encourage you to share it, particularly with other people, friends, family members, students in your school perhaps, that might be having a tough time right now. This interview with Lisa might give them some hope. You know, that if she can turn around the bad things that she was experiencing through her teenage years and build a great adult life for herself, then there's an inspiration there that anybody can do it. Lisa's the first to admit that there's nothing particularly special about her that's any better than anybody else. If she can turn it around, you and anybody else can do that too. I want to encourage you to go and get her books, and I want to encourage you to visit her website. And, you know, if you want to get more guidance like this, feel free to subscribe to the Unstoppable Teen podcast. You know, you can do that on iTunes, on SoundCloud, or indeed on our own website, unstoppableteen.com. If you want to get the show notes to this episode, get the links to the things that Lisa was talking about in the interview, you can do that at unstoppableteen.com/32. This is episode 32, so go to unstoppableteen.com/32, where you'll be able to get some help in developing those solutions like resilience that will help you recover from the difficult traumatic experiences that you or your loved ones might have experienced in the past. I know that at times talking about this stuff can be difficult, but it's really important that we don't make those mistakes of brushing things under the carpet and pretending like they're not existing or just hoping that they will go away. Invariably, things don't just go away. You have to get to that point of desire where you want to fix it, where you're not prepared to put up with the pain anymore and you want to make your life better. When you get to that point, the solutions are out there. And whether that's from us here at Unstoppable Teen, whether it's from Lisa Cherry, or indeed the other providers that are out there, please do not stay stuck in whatever form of pain you might ever experience. The solutions are out there. Oftentimes they're free. Sometimes you have to pay for them. But they are worth it. You're worth it. So make that investment in yourself. Make that investment of the time that's required to turn things around if you've ever had difficulties in the past. I thank you for listening. We're ever so grateful. Please help us spread the word so we can get more listeners. And I look forward to being back real soon with another episode that will help you become truly unstoppable. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.